New Orleans is a feast that cannot be movable or even conceivable anywhere than where it is and what it is. America, as it riffs off the southern edge of the continent, twisting through the rich effluvium of the Mississippi Delta, Cajun, French, African, Eastern European, Vietnamese, more, too many streams to name, an estuarine tangle of funky, soul-wrenching music and exquisite food, degrading corruption and daring ambition, cocky arrogance and big-hearted generosity, vehement intolerance and joyous diversity. This is a story of New Orleans. This is a memoir about another unhappy family made interesting, as Tolstoy knew, by their unhappiness. This is a story about complicated parents who live larger-than-life lives, one of whom fails from a great height and learns little, and one of whom succeeds to a great height and learns little more than how to achieve such a scaling. This is a story of the damage both due to their children. This is a story of how damage can weaken or strengthen its victims. This is a story of children who survive and remain damaged, or who learn and incorporate that learning into their own lives. This is, in other words, an old story. But all the best stories are, and what brings Randy Fertel's beautifully written book beyond a mere personal accounting and into the level of reflective American literature, is his understanding and the way his writing allows us to understand how his parents' lives illuminate who we are, at least that portion of ourselves defined by the city of New Orleans. By focusing with gimlet-eyed honesty on the audacious lives of as eccentric and outrageous a set of parents a writer could be cursed or blessed with, parents whose lives were shaped by and who helped shape the Dionysian excess of that city, Fertel manages to capture both the sybarite joys and costs to the heart and soul of living in and loving that place, fabricated and embodied by the jazz that it created, the food that it cooks, a city that nearly drowned because of the short-sighted greed and high-stakes gambling of its makers, but that is coming back stronger now because, like the author, it has recognized the flaws that must be confronted and fixed, and the strength and beauty that must be preserved and continued. Give you Randy Fertel.
I can't believe that my book inspired that beautiful. It's really great, Wayne. Thank you. Wow, so many of you. Thank you. Wet night. So I'm here to tell you about two iconic New Orleanians, and one of them I think I need to provide some context which isn't really underscored in the reading, and that is about my mother, who founded Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. And probably a lot of you don't know Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, but it was this tiny little restaurant that she bought in 1965, 17 tables. And she was kind of an accidental entrepreneur. Suddenly, people were asking to franchise and to take them all over the country and then all over the world. Now there are 134 of them, or is it 6? I never can keep up. And it's the largest upscale restaurant in the world. And at the end of the book, I compare her to Alice Waters of Chez Panisse. You may not have heard of her, but Alice Waters is kind of the queen of local and sustainable. And my mother, I don't think there are two women in culinary America that had a bigger impact on the way we eat. My mother created this prime steak world. It had existed before, but she convinced the marketplace that it was worth that extra money to come get the best. And Alice only had one restaurant, and yet she populated the culinary universe with her, I say kids, but the young people who came to cook under her. And so my mother grew out horizontally with her empire, and Alice went deep into who we are as eaters, but then also more subtly also went horizontally. So anyway, that's I just wanted to give you some background on my mother, and to give you a sense of how iconic she is in New Orleans. When my book launched, they did a 3-page feature story, and the headline was "Fertel All." And so basically, I tell everyone in New Orleans knows who Ruth Fertel is and knows the Ruth's Chris story, but I've come to tell the rest of the story, which they don't know. I do, before I get started with the reading, I do want to call your attention to my website, where there's a lot of material, parts of the book which I published in various places you can download for free and see if you want to buy the whole book. There's some videos, my conversation with Calvin Trillin, the great New Yorker writer, for my New York launch, a video of a part of a play in New Orleans. There's over the years, there have been a series of plays called Native Tongues, and they're always a series of monologues in the voices of local characters, accent on character. We really have colorful characters in New Orleans. And so this last spring, the topic was food, and I was invited to, it would have been fun to show it tonight. I should have thought to do that. But so there's a 10-minute cut from this play in the voice of the housekeeper that served my family for 42 years, Erna Sylvain, who was a real character. And I call her Eshu, the trickster figure, the person who is always stirring the pot, always causing trouble to make sure that people don't get up on their high horse. So anyway, there's a video there of her, and the actress just nails Erna. It's really terrific. Another thing on my website that I'll call your attention to is that I have a blog on it, but it's not a typical blog where I hold forth. Instead, I interview people whose interests overlap with the interests of the book. So it might be New Orleans or food or whatever. And there's some great, like, if you've been watching HBO's Treme, the producer-director Eric Overmyer was one of my interviewees, novelist Mark Childress, NPR's kitchen sister Davia Nelson, if you've ever heard of her, on Alice Waters is coming, a number of restaurateurs in New Orleans. So I recommend it, and hope you'll take a look. If the looks are bright and eager, as if a mouth-watering steak has just been set before them, then I know I'll hear, "Are you Ruth Fertel's son?" Or as if I were the offspring of a restaurant, "Are you Ruth's Chris Steakhouse's son?" That's the original steakhouse. She bought Chris Steakhouse and only had the right to that name in that location. So when she started expanding, she needed a new name. And we have this odd tradition in New Orleans of just adding names. There's a Pascal's Manali restaurant, and there's a Ruth's Chris. But if the looks take a decidedly wary turn, then I'm sure to hear, "Are you related to Rodney Fertel?" Or worse, "Are you the Gorilla Man's son?" For many years, the wary looks outnumbered the eager ones, until my mother's fame outdistanced my father's infamy. I was away at college during my father's Gorilla Man campaign, but mortified even at a distance. Ever since, his name and reputation have been hard to shake. Many still remember the Gorilla Man, some, to be sure, with fondness. In 1969, New Orleans was famous for potholes, poor schools, a failed economy, and political corruption of the highest order. We fixed all that. But the sole plank in my father's mayoral campaign bypassed such minor issues and went to the heart of our troubles. The zoo lacked a gorilla. Many were convinced he was sending up the political circus that is our way of life there. His campaign slogan sent this shot across their bow: "Don't vote for a monkey, elect Fertel and get a gorilla." His equally charming campaign manager who coined that slogan, the black cat Lacombe, was a racetrack tout known for how few bets he won. He responded to Dad's 310 votes in his New Orleans brogue. I didn't know they had that many gorillas in New Orleans. But for Dad, 310 votes was mandate enough. Long before the internet, he somehow found 2 gorillas in Singapore, bought them, lured them back with bananas, and donated them to the zoo. He and the black cat had a ball traipsing across the globe to Singapore to pick them up. I imagine them discussing the trip. Singapore? Sure, Rodney, I'll go. Where's Singapore? Black cat, I think you go to Hong Kong and hang a left. Naming them red beans and rice, Dad announced he was the only candidate in history who'd kept all his campaign promises, even though he'd lost. This gesture seems to have charmed many, for in the next campaign, because he became one of those perennial candidates, I could say joke candidates, but I won't. In the next campaign, he garnered 4,000 votes and came in 4th. Mayoral candidates, take note. Suddenly, he was a gorilla expert, counseling Ron Foreman, the zoo's new head, on everything they needed. From his travels, he would send special letters destined for his darlings. He asked Foreman to read them to my gorillas, and there would follow a bunch of gibberish that was his version of gorilla speak. Chi, chi, ooh, ooh, ah, ah, right out of Ramar the Jungle or something. He decided they were bored, so he bought them a TV. He announced Johnny Carson was their favorite. Here's Johnny, brought howls and chest beating, its absence melancholy. So Dad bought a VCR and asked the zookeepers to play The Tonight Show often. When he learned they weren't mating, because, captured as infants, they had never seen gorillas couple, Dad bought porno tapes, hoping the apes would, well, ape us. I'm all for letting nature take its course, he announced, but sometimes you can help it along a little. They never did mate, and finally were sent to other zoos to fulfill their destiny. Dad then mounted a campaign in the press to track down the gorilla nappers. People can learn a lot from them, he argued to the Times-Picayune reporter. He thought the Saints could learn some moves from them to use in the Superdome. And don't worry, they don't worry. They don't need automobiles, houses, jet planes. They're the most contented people, his word, in the world. They wear the same clothes all the time. They pay no income tax, no state tax, and they have humans working for them. I feel safer around the gorillas than a lot of people I know. But before he was the gorilla man, my dad was just a rich guy without much direction and with lots of time on his hands. Running for mayor was a way to kill time, as if, as Thoreau warned, you could kill time without injuring eternity. But having lots of time on his hands enabled Dad to become a world traveler, circling the globe 5 times. He believed travel was the best teacher, and because he needed company, I got to tag along. Dad first took me to Europe when I was 15. It was June 1965. Mom had just opened her restaurant. No one imagined it would become the Ruth's Chris empire, nor that Dad would one day become the gorilla man. Dad was a well-seasoned, though difficult, travel companion. He had a penchant for carrying oddball props. A golf club was one of his favorites. You don't want to lose your swing, he would say as he stroked imaginary balls in airport concourses, waiting for flights. Imagine now getting a golf club through TSA. Imagine being a mortified 15-year-old watching people watch your dad. Then there was the garlic. As we drove through the countryside that first day after landing at Ostend, he made me pull over to a farm stand. Garlic, fresh garlic, he rejoiced, and repeated the inevitable lecture about how garlic could cure all that ailed you as he peeled the cloves and popped toe after toe into his mouth. I opened the windows to fill my lungs with the sweet air of the countryside and my ears with the sound of the road. Surprisingly, travel was for Dad a way to close rather than open doors. Dad traveled in order to develop new prejudices. The Irish were this, and the English were that, and the French, oh my God, the French. To Dad, the Scots weren't thrifty, they were cheats. While I was buying a cashmere sweater at the Pringle factory, Dad was mining the salesman for a tip on the Derby, the biggest race of the British Isles. Dad played the long shot on the nose just for fun. When it won, he was told long distance that his prize was 80 pounds for his 20-pound show bet. He had expected 800 pounds. He swore that he had wagered on the nose to win. I couldn't convince Dad it was a misunderstanding, caught between the bookie's Highland and his own New Orleans brogue. He would have none of it. The Scots are cheats. By the time we hit Basel, Switzerland, he added a new twist. The Swedes are very rigid. Dad, they're Swiss. The Swedes are very rigid. No, Dad, they aren't Swedes. The Swedes live in Sweden. They don't care what I call them. Dad, it's like if someone calling you an Armenian rather than an American. I don't care what the people call me. Wait, I'll show you. I'll ask the waiter. Sir, do you mind if I call you a Swede? Politically neutral, of course the waiter told Dad just what he wanted to hear. Weeks later, one rainy night at the Barcelona Ritz, we shared a cab with a New Yorker also looking for dinner. Before the night was out, I was invited to Salvador Dali's house on the Costa Brava, where Miss Mafalda Davis, this woman, had a project to discuss with Dali. She was an Egyptian by birth and a jet setter by virtue of having been King Farouk's wife's unofficial lady-in-waiting. During our stopover in New York, precocious 15-year-old, I had spent many hours at the Museum of Modern Art, taken by Dali's melting clocks and Christ floating above Catalan seascapes. I was ecstatic. Dad declined. 2 days later, I found myself in an open-air restaurant in Cadaqués, facing a rocky cove. A few fishing boats and sailboats riding at anchor. A sky as blue as those in Dali's canvases, and my first paella. We traveled by hired car over the mountain to the next cove and to Dali's home, 7 fishermen's huts stitched together by hallways. A pink stuffed bear with a purple owl on its shoulder greeted us at the foyer. Dali's behavior all day, like his mustache, like his pink bear, was insistently meant to shock. It was as if during that stop at the Museum of Modern Art, I dreamt him, that surreal dreamer, and now I'd awoke in Spain to find him there before me. Dali impressed me, but his pet ocelot entranced me more. Though declawed and his teeth filed, the feral jungle cat was nothing but writhing lean muscle, rubbery like one of Dali's watches. It gnawed my earlobes with its filed-down teeth. What chills. A few days later, Dali, complete with cape, outrageous mustache, ocelot, and entourage, showed up at the Ritz. For my dad, it was love at first sight. Wild eye met wild eye. Dad had found a soulmate. Until then, I think Dad had thought it was he who had invented surrealism. Spending the next few days as part of Dali's entourage put a gleam in Dad's eye. One day, Dad announced he had a present for Dali. We were in the Ritz's grand sitting room. I cringed. What's Dad thinking of now? With all the flourish and fanfare that one drama king can muster before the drama king of the century, Dad produced a trophy from our visit to Switzerland, his prize compass. The compass was elegant in its own way. Well-made things impressed Dad, a taste I acquired, but it was just a compass. Dali turned it over, bemused, waiting for the punchline that would turn this toy into the tribute promised by Dad's ecstatic look. Misled by Miss Davis, Dali had taken Dad for an arts patron. You could see that illusion melting away in Dali's eye. As for me, I sat wishing I could melt into that velvet couch. Meeting Dali was a thrilling experience, but what I was seeking then and for years to come was to find a father. I was traveling with my dad, but I was looking for a father. I sensed Dali didn't fill the bill any better than my dad did. Like my dad, he was crazy, and crazy, even Dali's cultivated kind of crazy, was something I just didn't want to be. The son of this Mad Hatter, I've spent too much of my life trying to be normal. I now know that normal just wasn't in the cards. In time, I've had to learn to play the hand that I was dealt. My parents were married for just a few years. They each had a certain glamour, but it's a wonder that two such strong personalities ever shared the same coordinates. How had that come about? Which is to say, how had I come about? I asked Mom once, long after their contentious divorce, "Why did you marry him?" Her matter-of-fact response tried to hide her own befuddlement and hardly cleared up mine. "He had horses. I was at LSU, a country girl and a tomboy. When I first met him," she added with a caustic laugh, "I thought he was a stable boy. Turned out he owned the stable." Which means my first sibling rivals were racehorses. Later, Dad would add the gorillas, and my mom, the restaurant empire. After Dad dragged her through the courts for 10 years over the divorce settlement, and tired of making the measly sum of $4,800 a year as a Tulane lab technician, Mom was determined to put everything on the line. She pored over the classifieds. She came across a 3-line ad under businesses for sale. It's hard to read, but that's the original ad from which the whole empire grew. Established steakhouse for sale at reduced price. Owner retiring. Apply 1100 North Broad. It was a restaurant she had long known, serving prime beef she had long enjoyed. Chris Steakhouse had been in business for 38 years, opening on February 5th, 1927. "You gotta be kidding," she told the owner, Chris Matalich. "That's the exact day I was born." A devoted crapshooter, Mom saw another auspicious omen in the address. 1100. Had to be a winner. Chris, too, was from Plaquemines Parish at the mouth of the river. The price was $18,000. Determined and self-assured, "Steakhouse, I can do that," she approached her banker. Perhaps she wasn't entirely business savvy yet, though she became an icon of the business world in New Orleans and nationally. James Fallon Quaid looked the deal over and said, "What are you going to do for working capital, Ruth? How are you going to buy the inventory? Maybe you ought to borrow $22,000. She would always attribute her success to that insightful, generous gesture. Her brother Sig and her Tulane boss, cardiologist George Birch, both asked, "Are you crazy, Ruth?" Which no doubt helped her competitive juices flow. She took possession May 24th, 1965. Chris was supposed to show Mom the ropes for 6 weeks, but on the first day he came in, emptied the till, and walked out. She never saw him again except when he came to pick up the rent. With Chris gone, Mom had to teach herself to butcher the meat, give orders to purveyors, take orders from customers, pour drinks, and deliver the steaks, and hire the waitresses and cooks and everything. Meanwhile, men continued to disappoint her. Her second husband, Joe DiMatteo, brought to this new situation both his Sicilian paternalism and his years of experience in gas stations. He thought she should take his advice. She thought differently. It was Joe's laziness that finally set Mom off. In their final confrontation, she came home from the lunch shift and found him napping. This was the man who dared tell her how to run her restaurant? Who thought he was half owner even though he had staked nothing? On his way out the door, Mom sailed a pot of half-cooked rice at his head. Erna, our housekeeper, whom I mentioned earlier, and I watched. My excitement, surprise, and trepidation at Mom's sudden new adventure was joined by a sigh of relief. That pot of half-cooked rice freed Mom to marry her true destiny, the Empress of Steak. One mystery, then, is how my parents came to marry. The other is how this talented, warm, charismatic, generous woman had such trouble being close to those close to her. Here's from my overture. I begin the book with my mother's end. What's up here now? I'm not sure. Yeah. The Olympia Brass Band played Didn't She Ramble after my mother's body had been cut loose, as the saying goes in New Orleans, placed in the mausoleum she and her best friend had built together. As is customary in New Orleans, the band played a dirge, A Closer Walk with Thee, on the way to the entombment. Then, turning from the grave, we celebrated the life. Didn't she ramble? Didn't she ramble? Rambled all around, in and out of town. Didn't she ramble? Didn't she ramble? She rambled till the butcher cut her down. Ramble she had indeed, and not often in ways most would count ordinary. One night at dinner in the late 1990s, 5 or so years before, my mother announced that she and Lana Duke had purchased a plot at the prestigious Metairie Cemetery and would be building a tomb together. For almost 30 years, Lana Duke had worked hand in hand with Mom to develop the advertising in the Ruth's Chris brand. As Mom's empire grew, Lana not only worked for the company but also became part of it, owning franchises in San Antonio and Toronto. But I was stunned. A Fertel Duke tomb? There goes Lana again. She would be family for eternity, setting a new benchmark for BFFs everywhere. My next thought, however, was, well, after all, it's the first indication Mom's given that she's mortal. So, hey, don't stand in the way of this. Mom took me to see the cemetery grounds. As we walked through the tombs, among the tombs, Mom noted departed customers. He liked his filet medium rare. She liked her martinis up. We arrived at the 27-foot plot under moss-draped cypress trees. Mom liked the nearby lagoon, where the ducks swimming let her imagine she might hunt her way through eternity. Maybe you should bury me with my 12-gauge Beretta. She hoped the spot's beauty would encourage visitors to linger. I know you're all going to love visiting me here. The cemetery was once the site of the Metairie Racecourse, founded in 1838. A century or so later, Mom became the first licensed woman thoroughbred trainer in Louisiana's distinguished racing history and shared a stable of horses with my dad. Maybe we could install a betting window, she added. I pretty much forgot about this folly, until I got a call from a friend in the funeral business. His family had been bearing mine for 3 generations. He had just passed by the Fertel Duke Mausoleum. It's the most elaborate tomb to be built in New Orleans in 50 years, which is saying something, he didn't need to add. Outside, 3 colors of granite, bas-reliefs, pilasters, and granite benches. Inside, a stained glass window with an angel trumpeting Louis Armstrong's most famous line, "It's a wonderful world," and space for 3 on each side. The art department at Lana's company, Duke Unlimited, had designed it. Shades of Evelyn Waugh and the loved one. No doubt it was Lana who conceived the tomb picnic, too, which soon followed after its completion. Lana's instincts as a publicist do not sleep. 200 guests were invited for the blessing of the tomb. A large tent for the occasion was sited on the lagoon's bank. It was monsoon season, and torrential rains began promptly as we settled into our greasy barbecue chicken and ribs. If there's a tomb picnic for anyone on the planet that should not have bad food, I grumbled to my friends, it's my mom's tomb picnic. The band was a sleazy white party band from Fats Domino's Ninth Ward that played all the favorites that Fats and Frank and Elvis made famous those many years ago. But I wish they'd been walking from New Orleans. If there's a city whose tomb picnic should not have bad music, it's New Orleans, I grumbled. As the torrents continued, the lagoon almost overflowed. Soon we were surrounded by a moat, shielding ourselves from the downpour as best we could, removing our shoes and socks, plashing around in the water as it encroached. Father Bob Massett, a holy name priest and bon vivant, who had been enjoying Mom's steaks on his parishioners' dime since the 60s, parted the seas with his jokes and his benediction. Father Bob used to like his ribeyes rare, she announced when she took the mic. Lightning crashed close by. She jumped, and the sound system crackled. Have I offended somebody? She wondered. Her death in 2002 was still 3 years off. Rumor had it the tomb had cost $750,000, the most expensive shotgun double a friend quipped in New Orleans history. Question is, Randy, he added, will you be buried there? And who will be on top, you or Lana? I begged him to stop conjuring such images. Lana's got heft. The next day, beneath the banner headline, Tomb Share, the New Orleans Picayune covered the party for Ruth Fertel's ultimate retirement spot. Whoops. A large photograph showed Father Bob. That's this one. A large photograph showed Father Bob and Mr. Davis, who had been sculpting my mother's beehive hairdo since 1964, dancing a jig before the tomb with Ruth and Lana. Since our cities of the dead are on the tourist beat, almost immediately tour buses added the Fertel Duke tomb to their itineraries. But word got back to Mom that another rumor was making the rounds. Some New Orleanians took the double tomb to mean that Ruth Fertel was gay. For once, it was Mom who was stunned. She was always stunning me. I'd be totally nonplussed, but this time it was her turn. Almost to silence. Then simply, well, let them think what they want. I was proud of her. And so a few years later, the mourners formed the second line behind the tomb, behind the band and the family, what there was of it, marching and dancing to the syncopated rhythms in the hot mid-April sun. Everyone knew this is the way it should be. Though she grew up in the Delta south of New Orleans in Happy Jack near Port Sulphur in Plaquemines, Ruth Fertel was born in New Orleans and had thrived there, reigning as one of the great restaurateurs in a city of great restaurants. The brass band celebrated the considerable rambling she had managed. I had just done the same in my eulogy. A good friend who knew of my conflicts with my mother told me later he had a moment of panic when I rose to give it. I didn't know which speech you would give, he laughed. I knew either one of them could have been honest. My parents had colorful and fascinating lives, but to live inside their worlds wasn't exactly nurturing. My father, Rodney Fertel, was odd, self-centered, and nuts. My slight, feisty mother was determined to feed the world. Ruth Udstad Fertel won every accolade in the restaurant industry and became a female icon in the business world. The first lady of American restaurants, according to the official corporate narrative. But the Empress of Steak reserved all the glory for herself. Her appetite for winning excluded everyone, even her offspring. Nearly all the key players in the global empire of Ruth's Chris Steakhouse ended up suing her to get what they thought they deserved. I must confess, I was among them. A story you will find in The Gorilla Man and the Empress of Steak, a New Orleans family memoir.